a good thing we're at week 6. And we knew this was going to happen because the candle that we lit on week 1 is going to melt down, right? But as we move through this season, one of the things I got thinking about, and this is a dangerous thing, so I'll warn you, I woke up at like 3 this morning and had a completely different idea of where to go with the sermon. So you're getting a little bit different sermon than what I thought I was going to give. You'll get some of the other pieces of it too, but one of the things about the church that I think the church is a precious thing, and it's to bear a precious thing. And so, you know, I think that sometimes we live in a culture that wants everything to be fragile. And sometimes, you know, if you have kids in your house, maybe you use plastic cups. But if you only use plastic cups, when do they learn how to take care of something that's glass or crystal? And some of that is just the process of growing up and learning, you know, this is how I take care of things. This is how I be careful with things. This is how I treat things that are well. When we talk about fire, so fire on a candle like this is pretty fragile. You know, I could go up here and blow on it, and it'll go out immediately. At least if I get very much of it. Fire, when it's a bonfire, that's a whole different matter. That's not fragile at all. The more air you put on it, the hotter it burns, and the hotter it goes. But I see a lot of things in our world that seem to be getting more fragile. And so I'm going to go a couple different directions to start with. Bear with me, we're going to get there. Because we're going to talk a lot about the story of Acts today. So I bet that I'm maybe one of 2 people in this room who have any idea who this individual is. Maybe the only one. So this is Ben Herbert. He's the strength and conditioning coach for the Los Angeles Chargers right now. Now, most times in a football team, you have no clue who the strength and conditioning coach is. But the Chargers changed coaching staffs over this year. And again, I'm a fan. I follow these things, so you're going to... This is where sometimes my sermon ideas come from. So, the very first press conference of the new year, the first person they bring out is Ben Herbert, who Jim Harbaugh brought with him from Michigan. And the reason I'm going to talk about him in particular was his press conference was not your typical strength and conditioning press conference, because there is no strength and conditioning typical press conference, because they don't exist. But he came out and talked about the way in which they were going to change things. And he said, you know, a lot of strength programs are designed to break you down to make you stronger. My job is to do the opposite. My job is to make you hard to break. And what he said is that in football, most of your injuries are due to your neck, your shoulders, your hips, your ankles, and your knees. And so if you can strengthen the little muscles that make your knees stable, and your ankle stable, and your neck stable, and your shoulders stable, you can eliminate a lot of the injuries that come in a football season. Well, why doesn't everybody do this? Because it's a lot of work. And it's working really uncomfortable positions. Has anybody here had like rotator cuff surgery? And you had to do the motions to rebuild the muscles around the rotator cuff, or you sprain an ankle and you have to do the muscles to re-strengthen your ankle and all that. Everybody wants to go out and do bicep curls or go do bench presses or things like that. And those are all fine and good. But those aren't building around those muscles that are going to keep your joints stable. Those are the things that everybody wants to do because they look cool. He said, we're going to make you hard to break. Another story. So I'm going to guess most people don't know where this is. If you were in the Army, you probably do. So in the 1970s, when the Army came out of Vietnam, it was a broken organization. A lot of organizations through a period of trying to figure out who is it going to be going forward. And so in the 1980s, the military developed this group of training centers. This is the National Training Center in Fort Irwin, California. There's a Joint Readiness Training Center in Fort Johnson now. It used to be Fort Polk, Louisiana. And then they used to have one in Germany but they now just have the two in the United States. And what they would do is they would go out to these centers and they would fight a war once a month. They would bring in a brigade, which is about 3,000 to 4,000 soldiers. And they would fight a war there every single month. So you rotate through your brigades, but one of the things that would happen is the 11th Cav, who is the opposing force that you have to fight against, they fight on this soil every single month. They have the same capability weapons you have. They know what your tactics are. And so it's really, really hard to beat them. And it becomes one of these things to where it's not the question of did you win or not. It's how did you fight against an unfair opponent. And so the Army that emerged by the end of the 90s was a much more professional unit and much more well-trained unit than it was at the beginning of the 80s. Because they had learned how to be hard to break. They had fought against an opponent that was so difficult, and they fought against anybody else. And they had air superiority and everything else. All of a sudden it was easy. So, I'm going to say some controversial things here for a second. The good news is that no matter what we do, most of the time our kids survive us. The good news is most of the time our kids survive us. That, they're going to go out, they're going to make mistakes, they're going to stumble, fall, they're going to scab their knees occasionally, they break an arm or break a leg. But that's part of growing up, right? So, just curiosity question. So when was the first time, I'm going to have you raise hands for a second. When was the first time that you were allowed to go, let's say down the street to go play with a friend? Was it before age 6? Raise your hand. Age 8. Age 10. Age 12. 13. Okay. Do you know when people who are in college right now, when that average was? 13. 13 was on average when they were allowed to go by themselves without the parents supervising them, to walk down the street to a friend's house at dinner. And so, let me give you another. So, how many of you, when you find out your kids had a major project, strapped everything on your schedule to make sure that your kids would have all the support that they need to get that project done? Did anybody do that? The night before? And you were afraid to let them fail, right? Why? And on the one hand, I'm not trying to be mean, or I'm just asking why. Why is it so hard to let them fail? Why have we tried to protect them? So. Absolutely. So, she said she remembers how much failure hurt. And we want to protect our children from feeling that hurt, that pain. So, we've all heard what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? So one of the myths out there right now is what doesn't kill you can actually make you weaker. And not just physically, but emotionally. And we see this going on in our culture right now. So let me just give you a for example. There's a book in the library that I don't want my kids to read, and so so I don't want it to be in the library so nobody can have it. Have we seen that kind of dynamic play out? There's a group that's coming to the campus that I go to that I don't have to go to the presentation of that group, but because they're going to make a presentation on my campus, I'm going to protest that they're coming to my campus, and I'm going to make it to where they can't go there. My professor said something, or my pastor said something, or my boss said something I don't like, and so I'm going to tell somebody else about it so they get in trouble for it. And again, there are things that we need to be, one of the things about leadership is you set boundaries, you set borders, you set this is what's safe, this is what's not safe. This is a place where you can talk about these things. But I can't bubble wrap. So the early church was not a fragile thing. It was a resilient thing. But that wasn't because it didn't go through hardships. So one of the things that in the book of Acts, one of the things that happens very early. So the church has started to grow. They've set aside these 7 people who are going to be deacons for the church. Right after that happens, one of them gets killed. He gets stoned because he is trying to be faithful to who he is. This is Stephen. And the person who oversees the stoning is a young man named Saul. Remember that name, we'll come back to it. And things begin to get hotter and hotter for the church. So Peter and John are arrested. And there is this pressure on them to say, okay, well, what's going to happen next? And, they could crumble under this, or the wind is blowing against them to make them blow hollow. But this is not going to be without controversy. So Philip is the first disciple who we get mention of this. He goes out of Jerusalem, he goes to Samaria. And when he's in Samaria, he begins to, all of a sudden the Samaritans begin to listen to him, and the church begins to find a new place where it has a new home. Now the church is trying to figure out who he's going to be as well. So for example, are we still a part of Judaism? Are we something different? Now, one of the people who comes and observes what Philip is doing is Simon the Mage. Simon is a magician, or a mage, or a wise person, and he makes his money off people. And Deuteronomy was pretty clear that those people are not supposed to be a part of the community. And he gives up. Simon gives up these things that had made him who he was. He gives up his books and his scrolls, and he wants to follow because he sees in what Philip's doing something special. Now, is Simon perfect in how he does this? No. And so when Peter and John are released from prison and they come up and they're looking at what Philip is doing up in Samaria, Simon sees Peter and John baptizing people and the Holy Spirit coming on them and says, I want that power. I would pay you to have this power. Now, Peter rebukes him for this. And basically says, you're misunderstanding this. You've got it wrong. But Simon comes back and says, pray for me. I want to understand this. I want to be right. So, and then Philip is told to go out to a road. And as he's out on this road, there is a chariot that comes by, and in the chariot is an Ethiopian eunuch. Now, a eunuch, how many people know what a eunuch is? Most people? I'm not going to go too much into that, but let's just say eunuchs were not welcome in the community of faith. They weren't. But the Spirit says to Philip, go up to him. And so he's reading from the prophet Isaiah, and he's reading about the suffering servant who's going to suffer, and he says, I don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? And so Philip does. And as they're riding along, the eunuch, they happen to ride by a river or a creek, and the eunuch says, well, you've been talking to me about this. Here's water. Why can't I be baptized? And Philip says, what can I say? Okay, well, come down in the water. You're now one of us. Now, was everybody in the church excited about all of a sudden we're now including this new person? Probably not. Remember Saul, who held the coats and was overseeing the stoning of Stephen? Now, all of a sudden, he's on his way to Damascus to start persecuting the Christians who are there. But on the way to Damascus, Christ meets him on the road and blinds him and says, Saul, why are you persecuting? And then Saul goes is guided the rest of the way to Damascus, and now all of a sudden, the Spirit comes to another of the disciples and says, so you are going to go to Saul, and he's blind right now, but you're going to let him see. Now this disciple says, Lord, what? I know who this guy is. Do you know who this guy is? I'm paraphrasing. But that's what he says. God says, go. And so he goes and he lays his hands on him. Saul can see. He changes his name to Paul, and he becomes now the apostle to the Gentiles. And then Peter. Now, I'm skipping a couple stories here, but not very many. So Peter has been going throughout the area, and then all of a sudden he has this time where he's sitting there on top of the house, and God gives him this vision. And it's this vision where a sheet comes down from heaven, and it opens up, and it's all these things he's not supposed to eat. Lobster and shellfish and pork and different animals. And God says, kill and eat. And Peter says, I don't do that. I would never eat anything that is unclean. And the Spirit says to him, don't call unclean that which I've made. Goes up into heaven, comes down a second time. Says to Peter, kill and eat. I've never eaten anything unclean. Goes back up into heaven, comes down a third time. Peter, get up, kill and eat. Peter's beginning to catch on that maybe there's something going on here. So as it goes up the third time, there's a knock on the door, and there are these men saying, we want you to come meet our master. The master is Cornelius, Roman centurion. Now, the Roman centurion, these are the people who get associated with the crucifixion. So a centurion is a commander of 100. But it's a centurion at the foot of the cross who's there watching as Jesus dies. And there is this us, them. We see that in our culture all the time. They're them, we're us. A centurion and a Jew would have been very much an us and a them. But Peter goes. And as he goes, he's amazed because God's at work there. Now, that's where our Acts reading comes in today. After all these stories, where Peter says, now I get it. Now I get it. Now God's working where I didn't expect, but now I get it. And how can I withhold water for baptism? How can I keep them out? So much of our lives, whether we know it or not, are divided into these us and thems. And, it's one of the things that I really worry about in our culture right now is there are so many ways to protect ourselves and to keep us to people who think like us, act like us, believe like us, look like us. One of the studies I read recently, so they did a study of zip codes in the United States. And they wanted to see how many zip codes in the United States were what they call politically competitive. So within 8 points on a general election in a presidential election year. What do you guess the percentage was? 15. 15% of zip codes in the United States were politically competitive. Because people have self-segregated to live with people who think like them, believe like them. And then they wonder why people who live somewhere else think differently. Because they self-segregated to be with people who live like them and think like them. Church used to be a place where we could come together and talk about things, and be a place where we were aggressive with things. I could go and blow a candle out. But that's not what we're here for. God's able to take that which we do, let God's Spirit blow on it, and let that fire spread. And, we as church, we can look at all the different things in the United States right now, and there are lots of things to say church is struggling. And I get it. And if it was about me, I would probably agree with some of it, but it's not. It's about what God does. And I do believe we're at a time where God is able to take who we are and what we have and blow on it and do something new. But it may not always look like what we think it looks. It may not always appear like what we think it appears. And it may make us uncomfortable at times. It may push us to meet people who are not like us, who don't think like us, who don't do things like us. And I love our tradition. I love and I've been formed and shaped by it. But I also know that we live in a church that doesn't belong to me. It belongs to God. And the future is God's. And so, as we move towards this Pentecost, I wonder what God's Spirit is doing in this place. I wonder what God's Spirit is doing with these people. I wonder what God's Spirit is going to do. How it's going to take our fears and our concerns, and it's going to move us past them. Again, I'm a Lutheran. It's not about what I've done. It's about what God does. And so let's wait and see. Because God's not done.